Hey, this is Pierre-Yves Delacote talking. As you heard, I presented several times my methodology for good OCM engagement. It started with an assessment and strategizing, then executing, then measuring, then re-energizing, and you have to do that constantly since the cloud is changing constantly. The behaviors are changing constantly, so it's not just a project, it should be an attitude. Digital transformation is an attitude that you need to revisit from time to time. But I wanted to take some time on the assessment phase and strategize phase pretty quickly. And so what is an assessment? So it's pretty simple. There's a few steps and a few results. There are, to me, there are core, key for an team engagement. If you don't do that, your chance to succeed are very slim. So the first thing to do is to do a change impact analysis. Basically, try to understand what are the potential impacts on end users with this change. So you have this discussion with the team, project team, and some SMEs to understand, what technology is in place, what they're trying to move to, what technology they're going to implement. But that's not enough. Knowing, what the change is going to be is not enough. You need to understand people. You need to understand potentially how it's going to impact them. But most importantly, you need to understand how people are working today with the technology, where they're struggling. Um, and so you can achieve that only through interviews. Then you need to have a better understanding of the scale of the organization. It's the only way to do that, and you have to do that, is to do a survey. So you can feed your survey with your findings during the change impact analysis interviews, and you cannot do a survey without having done both steps before. And survey will give you some trends. I'll explain that in more detail in a few seconds. And then when you have done that, then you can come back to a panel of end users and do a focus group and, test if your findings are correct and ask people to prioritize the the usages, the feature you want to highlight, maybe the program you want to put in place. That's the core of the assessment. And then there's you can have some workshop if you're starting to strategize to understand what are the best communication options, avenues, patterns. Same thing, what kind of training you want to provide or other supporting activities. The communication workshops and training workshops are there for that reason. And the champion workshop also can help to scale the change, because if you in a large organization, you probably need champions to relay your strategy and support the end users with a better proximity, and probably also being able to translate in their own language, in their own perspective, what is how the technology can impact their co-workers. And the output, so if you're just doing the first four steps, the output is a set of findings. So trying to explain what you found during this assessment, what is striking, and what are the recommendations based on those findings. And if you do the communication training workshop and champions workshop, you also can start to build a plan to say, here are the activities that you should plan when, with some details and some recommendation how to execute this plan. So the first step is a change impact analysis. So it's about discussing with the project team, including the exec sponsor, what is the main driver, what is your vision, why are you doing this project, this change, discussing with them where they want to go and how far they want to go, how intensive they want to go in this transformation. This is key to understand how you want to plan to support this journey. Also understanding the goal. Why, what problem are you trying to solve? with this change. But most importantly is to understand the context. So basically, the context is about, what tools people are using today, what tools they're going to use tomorrow, what governance is in place today, what governance you want to put in place tomorrow, and to be able to measure the gap between the before and after transformation, and discuss a little bit also about the roles and responsibilities in this engagement. The interviews step is to first identify personas you want to interview. That personas are people who are going to represent the workforce. Usually from it to 10 people, but in large organization, complex organization can be way more. It depends on the size and the complexity of the organization. But definitely during an interview, you're trying to understand how people are using technology on different dimension. It can be a cultural dimension, it can be a technical dimension, it can be on the collaborative dimension, on the communication dimension, whatever subject you're trying to analyze. Try to identify their use case and see if they're struggling. Ask what are their pain, because if you can tackle a pain with the new solution, then you transform their lives positively. So try to identify that during the interviews. Measure also the resistance. Some people don't like the change and they're going to be very resistant, and try to understand why they're resistant. Sometimes it's just a psychological issue, and I will say not sometimes, most of the time. To give you an example, I was discussing with a person who was saying, Google migration was saying that, I use my Google account for a free or discounted subscription to Netflix. I don't want to lose that. So that's yes, that's a resistance. That has to be identified and addressed. And if you don't have interview, you might not find this. So you might not be able to manage some resistance if you don't know them. So, and it can be very negative. So it's really, really key to have interviews to understand some patterns and maybe sometimes some specifics. You cannot identify everything because you cannot interview all the organization. Everybody is specific, but it's important to have some of the patterns, and that's why it's important to identify the good personas. It helps you to have the storytelling of how people are working. So usually 10 at a minimum 10 interviews, 1 to 1.5 hour per interview, depending on the scope of the change. The personas, we try usually to identify one per department, but if you have a lot of departments, that might not be accurate. Just like, for example, in hospital, there's a lot of departments with not so many people per department. And you have to put a limit somewhere, but so maybe you need more than 10 personas, more than 10 interviews. And you need to try to identify in these personas people who are information worker, people who are working all the time in front of a computer, people who are task workers. So that people who are working from time to time in front of a computer, usually it's a shared computer. Frontline worker who are not working on a computer at all, or maybe sometimes on a shared computer, but mainly are using smartphones or tablets to work. It's also interesting to interview managers or specific stakeholders that you might want to listen to them, not just for an interview purpose in the sense of gathering information from their team. Sometimes managers don't know really well what exactly their team are how they're working. But there's, I will call it a shrink effect, where stakeholders want to be listened. So sometimes you have to add more interviews because of that, because they want to be heard. So it's part of the process. Also try to have some people who are very mobile, on the road all the time. And you have other specific personas, like if you're working in a hospital, you definitely want to interview nurses. A specific job might be interesting to be interviewed. And I will also add to try to have a mix of generations. It's important to have a good understand. This will help to understand sometimes there's a big difference regarding the technology with different generations. New generations have a tendency not to want to be trained, for example. They want to be more autonomous, and older generation don't want really to change when it comes to digital. So you need to gauge that and have a mix of generations. Um, Try to have a diverse environment when you interview, so to have different perspective and not have too many biases. I don't think you can avoid some biases because interviews are limited. And provide an email to invite interview. It's important that people understand why they're coming to the interview. Then the survey, so it's really discussing about the tool they're using, what is critical for them, because if you're transitioning one tool to the other, but you're putting a lot of effort in your change management program on this transition, and after the fact you figure out that people are not using the tool, or a very few number of people are using the tool, what was the goal of that? What was the energy you lost? So it's really measure how people are using the tools, try to identify some use cases, but mostly try to understand the pains, and see if there's a lack of not only lack of understanding how to use the tools, but maybe a lack of governance, common protocols, standardization. In general, in the survey, there are closed questions that help you to have data. So you can clearly, through those closed questions, see some trends, but also have some open-ended questions to gather some feedback, some storytelling also coming from the survey. And the survey modality is maximum 20 questions. Try to make a survey that less than 15 minutes. Make it anonymous for sure. You won't have the same feedback if it's not anonymous. So really, I encourage everybody to put it anonymous. Make it create a feeling of emergency, because usually I ask people to answer a survey within a week, because if you give them 2 weeks, for example, or more, people can say, okay, I have time, and they don't do it. So it's better to say you have 1 week. Also, the way you pitch it is going to be very important. Make them understand that you're surveying it's not just a corporate survey. It's something to fuel your program, to support them. So if you don't have feedback from them, you cannot support them correctly. They need to understand when you poll them, when you survey them, they need to understand that it's them talking to influence the design of a program, and helping, what I like to say is help us to help you. So they have a voice, and they can weigh on the strategy through this survey. And so you need to discuss that with the different stakeholders before sending the survey, and the sender of the survey is important. Message is very important. The sender is also very important, because if it's coming from a project team, or maybe the IT people might not see if it's very important or not. So try to engage the exec sponsor to send the survey to have a better reach, and ask maybe stakeholders to relay the survey, explaining this is very important for you, not just it's not for us as a corporation, it's for you, because if we don't know what you need, we cannot make it happen. So really if you can relay through managers or different stakeholders or influencers, that can help. And often I have the question, but what is a good uh, rate? Or how many answers do you need? So really, it's a good rate to me is 30%. Um, and a lot of organizations say, "Oh, it's going to be easy," and it's not. It's not easy. That for that subject, it's not easy to have 30%. So and 30% is enough, because when you have 30% of the population, you have a good amount of data to influence a program. So 30% is the right target, and it shouldn't be definitely not 10%. Even if with 10%, sometimes you have a good understanding of some patterns, but you might have some wrong data. So try to target 30%. So if you need to send a reminder in the middle of the week, send it if you see that it's far from the 30%. So then that's the assessment phase. I forgot, there's one slide I forgot to put, is a focus group. But the focus group is also important. So the focus group, let's take a minute on the focus group. The focus group is really an environment, a safe environment, when you invite a panel of end users and you demonstrate some of the changes and ask people to react and prioritize those changes. From the survey, you have some data, and you ask them, what will be the best benefits. But when they see it in action, they can realize if it's really a benefit or not. And also, you can introduce new things that they were not able to measure because they don't know what it is. So you can make them react and see what are the priorities. And it's also the focus group. It's also a good thing to start to excite people about the changes. And since through the interviews and survey, or at least you're guessing what's going to be the potential benefits and what can create some positive excitement, and then you can demonstrate that and see if there's real excitement about it. So it's also, the focus group is a way to amplify this excitement, or start this excitement actually, by demonstrating for real in a real demonstration that that's what they're going to have in a few weeks or a few months in their hands. So it's also starting to create the buzz internally. So then when you finish with the assessment, either you build a report. I'm gonna come back on that just in a few slides. But you can also, in some engagement, customers asking for to strategize. Okay, you have those findings, you make some recommendation, but how should I implement your recommendation? So you need to have a communication and training workshop to discuss about what are the communication avenues that are the most useful. And usually we ask this question during a survey to identify if there are, better ways to communicate with people, so they notice that there's a change and it's important. And so it helps you to have a better understanding of what's going to have the most impact. Sometimes it's just email, like usual. Sometimes it's more meeting with the managers. Sometimes it's more their intranet or newsfeed, a newsletter, or sometimes it's a social network, whatever there is, and what works the best. And you can have, through the survey, a better understanding what are the trends regarding that. And maybe you can filter this by department. Some departments can be more an email, other is going to be managers. So it really depends on the organization. So you try to identify those communication avenues that are available in the organization. Also, have a discussion about the communication sequence. Definitely some recommendations in terms of when do you announce a project, and then when do you give more details on the project, etc. So discuss this with the project team, so they can understand, that a planning has a logic, and so explain this logic through the sequence that you're recommending. And also highlight some important um, patterns in communication that when you're dealing with a project team that is not used to do OCM, they're very descriptive when they communicate. They want to cover everything, and the more you put information in the communication, the less people are going to read that. So there are some recommendations that they need to know to build an attractive and appealing communication so people can have access to this communication. And the training, the discussion about the training is to identify based on the survey, and also, there's budget consideration, there's resources consideration. What kind of training or what kind of support is is uh, is well sized for your organization, and where should you what training should you start with? Um, you know, I'm going to give you an example. For a long time, I started the to recommend the training with, um, you know, if there was a Microsoft 365 deployment, I was starting with, let's talk about Teams first. It's important to talk about Teams, or OneDrive, or Outlook. What's new in Outlook? But after doing several surveys, I discovered that most of the time, I would say 90% of the time, people were expecting, before you telling them that about the product, they're expecting you to explain, what is this Microsoft 365? There's so many things that I need to know what's in there, so then I can decide if one training is better than the other for me, because maybe I consider that this training is not interesting for me because I don't project myself in using this technology, or not using it heavily, or not needing a training. So that's the kind of discussion we have during a training workshop, and to identify what kind of training is needed for who. Champions program is really about educating on how you build a champions program to scale the change. So it's why do you create a champions program? Why do you need it? Then if the customer is convinced that there's a need for a champions program, and quite frankly, I don't see at a large scale how it cannot work, even if it's not, all the customers are not buying a champions program, because it means that you need to have champions and that you need to give them time. So there's some education about what is a champions program, why, what are the benefits. So start with that, and then explain how to recruit. So how do you recruit champions? It's not easy. Most of the organization is going to volunteer people, and that's not what you want. So you explain what are your criteria to identify the good champions, and then you need to define the kind of activities that you can provide to the champions, and also their role and responsibility. So it's important for them to understand how much time they need to spend as a champions, what do they need to give to their coworkers. So there's a give and get discussion around the champions program. And the results is, findings. So first, explain to the stakeholders who are part of the project what you discovered, what is striking, that has an impact on the program you're going to build. So there are several dimensions, like the cultural findings, the technology findings, the usage findings, governance findings. So people realize that what really the organization is living with this potential change, because most of the time people don't know. Most of the time the project team doesn't know. They have an opinion on it, and I can guarantee you that maybe, let's say 70% of the time, the project team thinks that the end user are not tech savvy enough, and they need training wheels. I heard some customers saying they need training wheels. And when you ask end users what is their comfort level with technology, it's very high. So there's a gap here. There's a problem of self-awareness or other ones. So it's important to share those findings transparently with the stakeholders so they can understand from an external viewpoint. It's not their viewpoint, it's an external viewpoint who did interviews, who did survey, who gather that and can give them a good understanding of what people are doing, what they're expecting, where they're struggling, what are their main complaints, and also identify from that what are the risks, and there are always risks, and what are the opportunities, and the opportunities should compensate the risks. That's a balance between risk and opportunities. It's important to be able to measure that so you can enhance or put the emphasis on the opportunities to mitigate the risk and also have a plan to mitigate the risks. And then you make recommendations. So based on your findings, you recommend what kind of OCM activities are important, like a champions program, recommendations in terms of training, in terms of communication, so high-level recommendations. And if you did a workshop for communication and training and champions, you can also provide a plan, a detailed plan. Usually I use an Excel sheet where I list all the OCM activities that has to be decided, and we discuss this plan and ask what they can really provide or not, depending on their context. So here are some examples of findings coming from the survey, coming from the interviews, with some metrics, some data that helps to understand, what are the trends regarding the collaboration, regarding technology, regarding the usage, digital skills, the governance. Here are some examples of recommendations, what people should, high-level recommendations. So what should they do? Here it was, it's about communication, about building a common protocol, common guidance, best practice. Education is key. How should you educate? So the survey helps you to identify that, do they want long-lasting training, or do they want to have access to short videos and learn by themselves, or do they want a mix of it, or do they want to ask their peers, or etc. And sometimes you find that through this engagement you see that you might need to have another technical project to help to go further. For example, when you're implementing Microsoft 365, but still keeping your file shares, and you're expecting people to fully embrace Microsoft 365, work in Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, but they still have their legacy in the file shares. So you cannot expect people to switch there because they will add a stream to their work, a new context, and they have to switch context. So maybe a recommendation is, hey, you should migrate those files. You can deploy Microsoft 365 so they can start to have a good understanding and a good experience on this technology. But don't forget, if you leave the legacy somewhere else, people are gonna work somewhere else. So you won't have the better adoption. So that's a recommendation. You might want to migrate. And some example of the plan. So here's a high-level sequence of recommendation. On the right, there's a detail of what you should do for each activity, for champions, for each technology, what kind of communication you want to put in place. So that was a quick example of an assessment, even going to strategization, and I really recommend to really do all the steps. It's important not to avoid any steps because some people might think, some customer might think that survey, I don't want to survey because I don't want to advertise too much the project. So they rather do interviews, but you know, with interviews you have more bias than when you do a survey. Survey will give you the data. Interviews will give you a point of view of some people. It might not be the right one, so you might want to validate that through a survey. Some people don't want to do interviews, so you can do a survey, but you might be out of scope because you will rely on what the project team is telling you, and so it's better to have interviews to see if how you should shape your survey to have the best feedback from the end users. I would say maybe the focus group is maybe the workshop that is not required for sure, absolutely. I mean, but it's definitely very positive because that's the first time you can maybe have a real feedback on your assessment, validate your assessment, showing you some results of the assessment and see how people are reacting to this. And that's the first time you're going to see if your assessment is going in the right direction and fine tune this through the focus group and start to excite people. So it really depends on your culture and your budget and so I will say try to do it all if possible. Um, it's better for sure to do it with external people who don't have a bias, who are not under internal politics pressure, um, and who have a new perspective and a candid perspective on the organization, which helps to discover more things. Hope this introduction to how to do an assessment was useful.